Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. We are finishing up our series by faith today, and it's a pretty simple concept, but so easy to forget. I've been enjoying our series graphic, someone paddling through a place of beauty that's also veiled a bit by fog and mist. Doesn't life feel a bit like that sometimes? You can see a little bit ahead, but you're not sure what exactly the future holds. And that's what we talked about in the first week with Abraham when we looked at the words of Hebrews that said, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. Surprise, surprise. Faith requires faith. It's not certainty. And so today we're talking about the way of the cross. Jesus says specifically, whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. And that's a phrase we hear repeated in the Gospels more than once, and I'll be speaking to that. But today's passage is filled with some other really powerful and kind of shocking phrases and images. For which of you intending to build a tower does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he's laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him. That's memorable, but the part of today's passage that is perhaps the most challenging and uncomfortable are his words about family. These words aren't just uncomfortable, but a bit disturbing as well. What does Jesus mean when he talks about hating family? I'd like to offer a few different ways of thinking about that language. First of all, it's always helpful to ask about the actual situation or social context for the comment. Does this say something about an actual on-the-ground reality the disciples were facing when Jesus spoke to them? And the answer is yes. In the early days of Christian community, disciples are being thrown out of their communities that they belong to. Being part of the community or your clan or your family was even more important to survival at that time than it is today. Taking another path and being cast out of your protective unit was incredibly scary. We have a story of Jesus himself being rejected by his own family and hometown at one point. So there was something about this way of life and movement Jesus was starting that was alienating some of his followers from their families and communities. And we'll get to that more in a minute. But secondly, in hearing these words, you may even have wondered if this isn't some form of hyperbole to make a point. And if you wondered that, there is some basis for that. In Jewish traditions, hate was used in some cases, as we would expect, in talking about enemies. But in other places, the word also got used in sayings that were very dualistic, talking about love versus hate as two responses, and the only responses to an issue or question, such as the wicked are said to hate discipline, justice, and knowledge, while the righteous hate wickedness, falsehood, and gossip. And you can find some of these instances in the Psalms in particular, as well as some other wisdom literature. In these contexts, the point is not so much about actual hate from a relational standpoint, but almost setting a kind of boundary around certain types of behavior or thinking. So even with that additional understanding, I think we can already say that these words have a a meaning different than how we might understand them at face value. There's a deeper moral or ethical question at work here. And if the statement about hating family and even your own life has an element of hyperbole to it, and is intended to make an extreme statement for the sake of drawing a distinction with something else, then what would that something else be? What would the opposite extreme be? Maybe the opposite statement could be found in the words of someone like Vito Corleone: never go against the family. Never go against your family, your clan, your tribe. Francis Fukuyama has written 2 books on the origin of political order, starting with the earliest forms of tribal community all the way up to modern societies. It's a fascinating insight into how humanity has organized itself from the earliest records of history throughout the world, and the benefits and dangers that communities and nations encounter and however we approach that. Fukuyama writes, virtually all forms of traditional culture, social groups like tribes, clans, village associations, religious sects, etc., are based on shared norms and use these norms to achieve cooperative ends. Such groups have a narrow radius of trust. In-group solidarity reduces the ability of group members to cooperate with outsiders. It is difficult for people to trust those outside of these narrow circles. Fukuyama goes on to explain that there's a higher degree of trust and moral commitment within that small inner circle in this kind of traditional culture and system. And on the flip side, there's a higher degree of distrust and lower moral standards toward those outside the circle, toward strangers. In other words, there's high integrity and loyalty within the family unit or the small circle of trust, but when it comes to outsiders, anything goes. Only thing that matters is you don't go against the family, right? Fukuyama explains that strangers fall into a different category than kin. A lower standard of moral behavior applies when one becomes, for example, a public official. This provides cultural reinforcement for corruption. In such societies, one feels entitled to steal on behalf of one's family. So the problem that I think Fukuyama sees and Jesus is also identifying, interestingly, is not that it's bad to be committed to your family or to love your family or even your clan or your tribe. Of course, Jesus teaches love, and love for both neighbor and family, and we should absolutely love our family. The problem is if the community or group you're living in requires you to love only your family and not your neighbor or the stranger effectively. If you encounter that false choice, then this is what I think we should be wary of and what I believe Jesus is talking about. That's the point that I believe is at the heart of his words today about family. And to outgrow clans, to be able to love the neighbor beyond your clan and even the stranger and enemy requires a new way of life to make that possible. What I believe Jesus is identifying and what the disciples were experiencing was that following Jesus meant some of them were being cast out of their families and their entire community. They were discovering that to follow this new way meant they were either in or out. So on the surface, the words of Jesus can sound troubling, and to be sure, they're still not for the faint of heart. But they can be misunderstood and dangerous without the proper context, as if we are to somehow actively hate people. That's not the point, even though at the time Jesus spoke those words, the disciples were discovering that possible outcome that they would be torn apart from their families of origin and clans. I don't know if we would say the same today happens on a larger scale, save for the kinds of division that were seen during the Civil War, for example, when families were split. But it's important to point out a paradox in all of this as Jesus calls for the disciples to make a commitment to following him over and against family where that becomes necessary. It might seem that for Jesus to ask his followers to devote themselves to this new way of life over their families would simply be exchanging one fairly narrow circle of trust for yet another narrow circle of trust, if yet perhaps just a little larger. One tribe for another, essentially. And what gain is there in that? How good and valuable is that? But I'll circle back to something I've spoken about on a number of occasions in the past. What Jesus does is revolutionary, and it's in full view in the rest of this passage. Instead of associating with an exclusive group, whatever it is, for the sake of gaining power or privilege of some kind, what Jesus offers is different, at least if it's understood and lived out faithfully. When you become a disciple or student of Jesus, it's becoming part of a movement that in the end empties itself. In other words, it seeks not its own advantage, but the good of the other, the neighbor, the stranger, even the enemy, even at the expense of itself. This is the way of the cross that Jesus is speaking about. And it's astonishing and foolish to those trying to look for a strategy or group that will help them acquire or maintain power or influence or advance their own agenda. The entire agenda of Jesus is essentially to honor the original promise to Abraham, to bless all the nations of the earth, not just one. To love not just family, but neighbors and strangers and enemies. And those who insist on limiting those blessings stand in opposition to what Jesus is doing. That sounds terrifically idealistic. But how, a Christian might ask, are we supposed to advance our cause and our faith if we just give it away and give up our influence? I think this is a question that is front and center for some Christian movements today. And it's a bit of a wrong question based on a model of worldly influence. That's not the mission of Jesus. Jesus clearly rejected that, in fact, even in the final hours of his life when everything was on the line. To embrace that false shadow mission is not actually Christian, but is a distortion of it in name only, and is actually a full-on rejection of Jesus himself. It's the gain the whole world but forfeit your soul kind of mission. It's a devil's bargain that grants some one or some group power only to find its void on the inside. The way of the cross, on the other hand, is ready to give it all up and have nothing to show, but actually discover the miracle of God's self-emptying love wins in the end. And yet, even that is not intended to be some clever winning strategy. It's too painful and requires too much sacrifice to be embraced by anyone who simply wants to win with an unconventional strategy. No, the way of the cross is an embrace of Jesus and love overall, an embrace of goodness toward all neighbors, even those who may not embrace us. To do anything else is simply a will to power and is no different than any other movement or system, whether it associates itself with faith or not. To follow the way of the cross celebrates what is distinctive about the Christian way and what has been so redeeming and miraculous and sacred about it over these many centuries. To be clear, this incredibly challenging vision for life as a disciple is something the disciples themselves did not carry out perfectly or see perfectly, and neither do we. Jesus offers us grace and forgiveness when we fail to understand or fall short. And yet this standard and vision for our way of life remains as a North Star, a place to set our journey toward. And so what does this look like in a modern society like ours? This should be part of our ongoing conversation, but as one example, it can be quite simple. And perhaps this is obvious, but it merits just stating. Even as a Christian with deep convictions, you can love neighbors who are Muslim or of any other religion, for example, because they are also God's children. You can embrace neighbors, and yes, even family to the point of today's gospel, who are not religious at all, because they too are our neighbors. You can love those who come to different conclusions than you do on moral issues of the day while still making your voice heard and speaking to another vision. Even with the most devout interpretation of Jesus' words today, our mission is not to harm those who do not share this way of life, but to simply be clear about our priorities and our ultimate mission. It is to remain distinctive and true. It's easy to take words of Scripture out of context and use them to justify any number of agendas. The same is true of any expansive writings or philosophies. And some have undoubtedly taken words about hating family or one's own life in today's passage out of context in the past in a more literal way. But as Christians, our intent is to be part of the greatest mission of all time, that through our ancestors in faith and through us, all nations and peoples of the earth might be blessed, not only ours, not only our family or tribe, but all peoples. And to do so inevitably calls us to the way of the cross, because in some cases, certainly not as a rule, doing so can cause us to be rejected by those we associate with, even those closest to us. The life of a disciple is done completely by faith. There are no guarantees of winning the day or being honored among contemporaries, of even staying in the comfort of your current home, but the life of a disciple involves the perseverance of faith. This is the greatest aim of our life as we seek to bring blessing to all people of the earth, or to put it as Jesus did, so that all may have life and have it abundantly. May you choose to live by this faith. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.